goodness. Oh, sweetie pie. Oh my goodness.
Her smile is just like yours, Evelyn. She has your smile.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, so sweet. Okay, so good morning, everyone. I see people in the house. Let me try to, I see the beautiful people here this morning. This is a panel, one of two panels at the conference, co-organized by the Association for the Study of Black Women in Politics and NCOPES, and actually one of three. There's another one happening right now with Tiffany Willoughby-Herrard and Francois Cormier and some, I'm putting her in Louisiana, Comer, and happening right now too. This panel in particular is one that is dedicated to the 30th anniversary of critical seminal piece by Jewel Prestage called In Quest of African American Political Woman. As many of you will recall, 30 years ago when this was published, Dr. Prestage really in that piece laid out a framework for understanding Black women as political actors. In the discipline at the time, there was a lot of discussion about political man and what that meant, not only in terms of political theory, but also how we investigated political activity, how we conceptualized about political actors and the widest range of ways in which people have been active politically, and to expand those notions. Of course, and people talked about political woman, and Jewel Prestage dared to point out that there are Black women who are important as political actors, and she titled the piece In Quest of African American Political Woman because it captured the project that she was about, she and others were about, her principally, of course, in terms of really trying to center the experiences of Black women. And so we want to make sure that we are mindful of that challenge that she laid out for us long ago. She was always very strategic in terms of thinking about what she chose to do, especially in terms of her research, because she understood herself as laying the groundwork for the subfield of Black women in politics. And so we're grateful today to have this opportunity. And when we look at the very rich offerings of work at this conference and prior conferences, increasingly we've seen more and more people who are doing work on Black women as political actors, on Black gender politics, and this conference, in every time slot, we have seen people who are just presenting amazing, amazing research. And so we're grateful for her vision and her foresight. And I think it's important as well to return to that piece because it's very rich. It lays out not only a kind of conceptual framework, a priority on Black women as political actors, deals with conceptually understanding politics, not only in terms of formal politics, but in terms of informal politics, really expanding the range of activities that we understand in terms of the African-American political woman, Black political woman. And she also looks throughout different time periods in US history to understand the role of race and gender in the development of American political institutions and social movements, Black women's club movements, and a range of things. And she also very provocatively raises questions about feminism as an ideology, how it operates within Black politics. And so I think it provides us a very rich springboard for understanding the tasks that we have before us. And so we have three presenters this morning, myself and Pearl K. Dowe, who I will point out is this year's winner of the Anna Julia Cooper Publication Prize for her wonderful piece that she's done on Black women in politics. And then we'll have Jamil Scott, and then I'll go last, and we can each talk for about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we should have plenty of time to discuss. Does that sound like a plan?
Mm-hmm.
We can get with? Okay. Well, all right. Dr. Dowe, we'll start with you.
Well, Dr. Alexander-Floyd pretty much did my presentation for me. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let me get back here.
Looking fly this morning on a Saturday. That's how we do.
Okay, so this morning I'm going to be brief because I know the goal is for us to have a in-depth and rich conversation about what we know about Black women politics. But I want to start with talking about this article and touch on some of the points that Nikol raises and some of the things that I really appreciated, particularly as I gave it a closer read this week than I had previously. And so I just really want to talk about this legacy of this quest and some of the questions that we currently have that my next phase of research is going to look at. So when we look at this article, as Dr. Alexander-Floyd mentions, is that it's written at a very pivotal moment in our state of American politics, and particularly within the discipline. The discipline is extremely male, it still is, but particularly during that period, extremely male-oriented in who was studying electoral politics, and pretty much the research outside of what was happening in Coates really saw Black political behavior as beginning post-Voting Rights Act of '65. And so you have Dr. Prestage here very boldly taking this article to elevate our understanding of political behavior. But I think one of the key components is that, particularly in the first paragraph, she talks about this non-traditional political behavior, which speaks to, as Dr. Alexander-Floyd mentions, her commitment to the scholarship of Black political behavior and the foundations of NCOPES, that this non-traditional behavior, it is not just with voting and civil rights protests, that this behavior and the socialization to be political goes back to the period of enslavement and the fight to end slavery. And even talking about enslaved women and how rape and the response to rape and sexual assault and physical violence, how that itself also play a role in this socialization to address and to resist oppression through political activity. Then we also see one of the other strengths of this article is that this chronological approach, again, strengthening this piece that this is not just about post-1965 activity, that Black women have been critical to this type of political socialization, this political work that has been going on. And so she walks us through each period, these milestones historically, and centers Black women, and then also raises these questions about how did Black women respond? Why did they respond in these moments? She also guides us through the current scholarship at the time and raises questions about where Black women in politics, the study, where it should go. So it's an analytical tool, challenging scholars to say there's more work to be done in truly understanding American politics, Black politics, and Black women in politics. But one of the things that I noticed this week as I went back and reread it was that the citations. We're in a moment where we're constantly talking about cite women, cite Black women, cite women, scholars of color. And if you look at these citations and the quotations, Dr. Prestage is very deliberate in who she cites and who she quotes. She is citing the foundational scholars in Black women in politics and women in gender studies. So we see some of the early works by Sue Carroll. We see Paula Giddings, Pauline Stone, a lot of this early foundational work on Black women in politics and Black women political ambition, right? Because ambition studies, particularly at the time, really was about men and how they move forth in seeking political office. So again, another groundbreaking component of this article.
Mm-hmm.
So also, when we talk about scholarship, we can tell outstanding scholarship because it has legs. And this piece and the work of Dr. Prestage has had legs that extend to this political moment, and the research and the questions that we are asking, and our members and our sister members in other disciplines are asking. And so this article raises questions about the gender gap. She talks about the gender gap. Mm-hmm. And how white women participate differently than Black women, and how we have to understand that differently. So she raises that question years before we see it coming about. But we see that question coming forth again and being addressed by our own scholars. It's a foundation for intersectionality. Mm-hmm. She talks about these relationships and how Black women are challenged, but also she talks about how Black women engage with Black men that is different, right? Mm-hmm. And how Black women and how they present and address issues and their understanding of the group. She pointedly talks about that. There's a foundation of Black feminism. Mm-hmm. And then she also gives us this paradox of participation that Wendy coins for us. She gives Wendy that foundation in talking about how these markers that we tend to ascribe to who should participate, how this does not fit this woman, but she still participates. And she also begins to set this record straight that we see about Black women participating during moments such as the suffrage movement and the abolitionist movement, which we see our sister in history, Martha Jones, extends in her book Vanguard. And then she also continues and lays this foundation, as I said, about political ambition that so many of us, myself, Wendy, Nadia Brown, and others have continued to talk about. Jamil has a recent piece. If you haven't seen the most recent NRBP, Jamil is the lead author on a piece about Black women running for office and how they make that decision to run. And so just the extensive amount of work that has come from the questions that Dr. Prestage has posed, as I said, is a testament to her legacy of this article and of her other pieces of scholarship. And so this leads me to this current moment in understanding the new questions that we have, where we have seen a lot of work around why Black women are running, that Black women can win, and particularly a lot of the work over the last 3 years, where we look at the rise of Black women running for office, particularly on the local level. We've seen Black women become mayors across the country. We've seen an increased number of Black women running for office and winning in state legislatures, as well as Black women running for Congress. And then we also see the increasing number of Black women that are in positions such as DAs and now state attorney general. So we're seeing this expansiveness of where Black women are running for office and how. But this leads me to a question that I currently have, that my next project, I'm going to be working with Emmett Riley and Ashley Daniels with this new paradox that we see coming about in 2020. We saw an unprecedented number of Black women that sought congressional seats. And according to the Center of Women in Politics, there were 129 women, Black women, who ran for Congress, and 68 made it to the primaries. Of those, 22 Black women who were incumbents retained their seats, but only 3 non-incumbents won. And so that raises a lot of questions about Black women running for office. And the reason it raises a lot of questions for me is because in this moment over the last year, we saw a different type of Black woman politician. We saw a Black woman politician, many of them had been trained, had received political trainings. Many of them had access to a significant amount of money. Some of these women who lost actually raised more money than their opponents. We saw these women also gaining national attention. They had been profiled in the media. Many of them were highlighted every weekend on MSNBC. They were profiled in other media outlets. And so there's this new question, this paradox is that why do Black women lose when all the indicators that we have said that women need to have to win, when these women had it, they still lost? And so what are the new strategies that Black women have to have, particularly in this hyper-racialized, hyper-partisan dynamic? And then also, what is it that we know about these states that Black women are running in, right? So one of the areas that we're going to look at, the candidates, that we're going to be looking at initially is Joyce Elliott, who ran in Arkansas for Congress, Timms, who ran in Ohio, and Candace Valenzuela, who ran in Texas. They all lost, but they all, particularly Elliott and Valenzuela, they had a significant amount of money, raised millions and millions of dollars, high profile races. Elliott particularly had tilled the ground for years in Arkansas. She was a state legislature, a very high profile state legislature, and still lost. So we see that we have to ask some new questions, because the climate is not going to get any better. And so what are the strategies and what are the efforts? And so I'm going to stop there, because I think that this is a conversation that I would like for us to kind of have, to kind of give us as a research team start to look at this, some things to look at here. But I will just conclude and say that these questions that I have and others have, that if it was not for the groundbreaking work of Dr. Prestage leading us into this direction, we may not have the tools to come up with the answers. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so very much. And now we will hear from Professor Jamil Scott. Let me highlight you here. Okay.
On mute. Sorry. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be with you all and happy to be a part of this panel. It's always good company to see the faces of people that I recognize through work and through the work that they've done, and personally that I've been able to meet and have it had an influence on my work. I didn't have the opportunity to meet Dr. Prestage, but I can say that her work has had a very deep impact on how I think about my work, and informs the question that I'm going to talk about today that is a part of my book project. So the piece is entitled, "It's All About the Money, Understanding How Black Women Fund Their Campaigns at the State Level." And so it's very serendipitous that Pearl and I are on this panel together, because we are again talking about the same question. So it's her at the national level, me at the state level. So it's always good to be in good company. So I'm excited to hear what you all have to say and think about this question more generally. I came to this question. I want to start with the motivation for how I came to this, and then speak to how Dr. Prestage has had an impact here. So I think the motivation here for me is that the cost of elections has continued to increase each election cycle. And we tend to think about this as a congressional phenomenon, but this is very much something that's happening at the state level as well. That in 2008, we see this landscape where state legislative candidates had collectively raised over $800 million. And then by 2018, we're looking at candidates raising over $1 billion. And so granted, we can think about how this might be differentiated by state in terms of professionalization and those types of things, but the money landscape is changing, right? And we know that there is still this descriptive representation problem that people frame as a women of color problem, and I'll get to the disaggregation that is needed here to think about what Black women bring to the table and how Jewel Prestage gave us the outline for that. But I think more generally, if we think about state legislatures as this pipeline to congressional office, then it's important to understand how and to whom money flows for candidates to fund campaigns. And so I'm not speaking to an audience who doesn't know, right, that this figure doesn't represent what's happening in the landscape for women, for Black women, right? We often see these images that show what's happening for white women versus women of color, right? But as we all know, that disaggregating the term women of color is really important, right? And I think that's what Jewel Prestage told us from the beginning, that we need to tell the story about Black women. And telling the story about Black women is about framing their context and speaking to how, when you think about this story by what's happening by group, it looks very different, right? And the numbers show that Black women's numbers have been increasing. Now, this isn't a new story because it's a story that many of you have told in your work, and a story that Jewel Prestage has told us before, right? She was telling us this in the 70s, that Black women had an outsized representation in state legislatures. It's not new, and I will not pretend to be new in talking about how Black women have been doing this thing for a long time, right? And I appreciate Jewel's work for speaking to how Black women were shifting from non-traditional to traditional political participation, right? That there was a shift here, but Black women still are impacted, or their political life was still strongly impacted and is strongly impacted by social organizations. So not only did she question how we think about political ambition, especially for Black women, but she questioned the impact of social organizations. And I see this work as thinking about this question of how do social organizations matter in a slightly different way, because I take on the question of how does money matter, right? And so one of the things that I'll bring to the table here is that we already know this story, right? And I cite more recent pieces, but Jewel Prestage was telling this story long before, right? That Black women have been out here and doing the political work. But one of the questions I want to bring to the table is, how do we think about Black women's presence and their continuing increase here, along with the rise in campaign costs, when we know that Black women don't necessarily come from money communities, and there can be gender disparities, and campaign finance can be a cause for concern, right? And so in thinking about how Jewel Prestage influences this argument, right, and what brings to the table, how she has influenced me here, right, is thinking about that because Black women aren't necessarily coming from money communities, we see a push towards social organizational life. And I see maybe that's happening in a different way here, that we can think about PACs and other organizations that have been helpful helpful for women, right? The Higher Heights, the Emory's List to some degree, right? Doing this work of elevating Black women at the state legislative level in terms of helping them to be able to fund their campaigns. And so I think that maybe we have moved away from a space where social organizations were, we rely more on PACs to do this work, right? The Color of Change and others to do that organizing work in terms of raising money, right? But I think we can look back to Jewel's work to speak to how social organizational life was happening for Black women, and they were being, their political life was being impacted, and the money was coming from somewhere. I'll say it like that. And I think that what I speak to here, right, is maybe an incomplete story. It's a PAC story, but I know that Black women's organizational life, their participation does have an impact on how they were able to fundraise, right? One of the things that the conclusion that I come to from my work here is that Plaques play a strong role in this story today. And but these groups are making choices about who is in a winnable race. And I think that can have an impact on who is able to run a competitive campaign. And so I'll say that as I am confronting and thinking about my own work here, about how organizations like PACs matter, I'm thinking about the older stories like Jewel Prestage was telling about how organizations maybe mattered in a mutual aid type way, how organizations were mattering in Black women's social life in ways that we're not able to capture in a follow the money type data way. So that's one of the things that I'm thinking about, and I look forward to your thoughts here. But in terms of what I bring to the table on where Black women receive funds, that is my essential question here, from a way in which we can document how women, particularly Black women, are being funded by PACs, by individual sources, by parties, right? And so I think here, if they are advantaged or disadvantaged, in this presentation, I focused on their relation to other women. And so there is a women in campaign finance story, but what I think is missed here is a story about racial considerations, a story about Black women and how their story is different. And so this is what I seek to bring to the table, and I try to use state variation to do that. There is some work that has started to do that, Grumbach and Son, and Grumbach, Son, and Staszek, and Grumbach and Son. They might be an exception here, but they focus on Congress and not at the state level. And so here, I use candidate data from 2012 and 2014, state legislative races, and I use these because I'm able to identify these candidates by race. I also rely on the DIME data set from Adam Bonica, but hopefully what you'll see in the book is that I don't just rely in the DIME data set alone. I go back and have painstakingly collected data on my own, a labor of love that I am still working through. I also rely on the correlates of state policy data set as well. So here my dependent variables are log total contribution, log individual contribution, and log PAC contribution. And I don't want to belabor the point here. I am focusing on women, and I examine race and incumbency status. And so descriptively, there is a difference here, right? And I think that speaks to some of the work by Cristina Bejarano, right? In terms of what she talked about the Latina advantage, but we are seeing in terms of how Latinas have the highest average total receipt. But what we see here is the average receipt from PACs is higher for Latinas and then followed by Black women. So I think this begs the question, how are PACs mattering here, particularly because they are making up the lion's share of donations when we think about Black women and Latinas. And so I won't even pretend to speak to Latinas because I think Cristina Bejarano did that very excellently. I want to think about what Black women are doing here and how we can think about their story in terms of PAC contributions and what that means. And so I think about their comparison here, right? And so when we talk about log total receipts, right? I don't want to belabor the point or take a long time here, but what we do see when Black women are considered the comparison category when we compare everybody else to Black women, it's white women who are advantaged in terms of total receipts, but they, in comparison to Black women, white women are disadvantaged in terms of PAC contributions, advantaged in terms of individual contributions, and advantaged as challengers in terms of when we're talking about party money. So I think there's something to be said here about how there's no difference with Latinas, but Asian American women are disadvantaged, as are Native American women, but not significant here. There is a significant difference from white women. So I take that all to be some evidence that there is a PAC story to be told here, right? And so I think about folks like Stacey Abrams and others. As I was writing my dissertation, I was wondering why they were going through multiple programs or participating in so many organizations. And I think that maybe it's not the, and so I think that there's an argument here about Black women not of confidence, but we know that's not right because Joel Prestage told us that they were confident, right? And so I think that maybe they're going through these programs for the money, right? That if we think about, George's win list, Emily's list, there's a monetary contribution. So they might say, we're going to train you, right? But these women are already trained, right? They come in confident, they come in prepared. There's a monetary aspect to this. And so I think that that may be what Black women are taking advantage of when they are doing multiple programs, right? And so I think that this is why the question of how do we separate these program participation in terms of I'm going to learn how to run for office versus I'm going to gain money, because there's a money arm to this, is a very interesting question. And it brought me to bring up this question in the book, particularly for Black women. So I think there are some implications here in terms of thinking about what the possibilities are for Black women, right? In terms of, especially at this time point where we have a Black and South Asian woman who is vice president. We've still never had a Black woman serve in a governor's seat, and very few Black women serve in leadership of their state legislatures and government. And so I think there's a clear story about how money matters, but it also dictates which women are able to take up the mantle of political leadership. And I think it also may frame how Black women see their approach to office, whether that be affiliating themselves with different programs like we've seen, different women be part of Color of Change or Emily's List or Higher Heights. They take advantage of these multiple programs. And I think that's because they have a monetary component. And sometimes that story often comes through as women aren't confident, they do these programs over and over again. Well, maybe it's a money question. And women see this as an approach to be able to fund their campaigns. And we know that we don't all come from necessarily money communities, but if these PACs are going to share, then they want to be a part of the number. And so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
All right. Now just the chat has been active, so we have to make sure we keep an eye on that. Professor Sharon Wright Austin mentioned that this work should be sent to the APSR. I agree, because it is fabulous, and really interesting comments too about thinking about the programs as being organizational resources for networking, etc. So I will just share some of what it is that I'm working on. Praise be to God. I just finished my book. Woo. Reimagining Black women, critique of post-feminist and post-racial melodrama in culture and politics. Part of what I am working on now builds on some of the same kinds of themes that I explored in the book, particularly as it relates to Black conservatism. And I'm working on an article now on gender and Black conservatism. in really trying to get to not only Black women's participation in GOP national politics in circles, but also just the gender dynamics in general that are operating in racial dynamics as well. And I come to this as a kind of effort to really, join and different literatures and stage a conversation, in particular between Black politics, as we talk about it in political science and psychoanalysis. And one of the works that's been very influential in my thinking is by Claudia Tate. And it's interesting to think about the time period of the book that she published, Psychoanalysis in Black Novels, because it actually also was about 30 years ago that she published that, as well as an influential piece called Freud and His Negro that talks about the relationship among Black studies in psychoanalysis. But part of what she deals with in that text is a way to understand non-canonical works in Black literature. She observes that work by canonical figures such as W.B. Du Bois or Zora Neale Hurston that fell outside of what she called a protest model, or work that did not directly challenge racial oppression, generally got neglected in critiques of Black literature. So she wonders why, finds it curious. And part of what she does in examining those non-canonical works is to suggest that in looking at those works that people tend to ignore, right, because they're focusing on a particular model, they miss something that is actually very important. In fact, part of what she demonstrates is that it's actually in those non-canonical elements of those, in some cases, canonical figures like Du Bois, that you find repressed elements in Black culture and Black politics. And it's hard to do justice to her work because nobody does it better than Tate does. But she essentially argues that it's through looking at those repressed aspects that you can actually find structures, which she refers to as a phantasmatic, that you can then go back and use to read the whole body of work by particular actors. The analysis she has of Richard Wright, I haven't seen a better one. It's absolutely mind-blowing. Du Bois as well, pull it, and really, she doesn't frame her analysis as quote unquote feminist, but she looks to desire and broadly defined, not only in terms of sex, but including that, and really teases out the gender politics of lots of these figures. And so part of what I've tried to do is to look at the kind of repressed aspects of Black politics, right? Because as she says, in looking at those repressed or unconscious discourses, again, you can find the narrative fragments that fulfill latent wishes, much like dreams. And it makes visible the ways in which we have circumscribed Black subjectivity and Black textuality by a reductive understanding of racial difference that has in turn made concepts of race and desire, where desire is understood to encompass a broad range of concerns, not just sexual longing seem compatible. And so that broad range of desires, I argue, encompasses as well what happens in the realm of the political. And so in a similar way, the study of Black politics generally focuses on those actors who identify with liberal or left-leaning politics, because it does not support a progressive social justice model. Conservatism is one of the repressed aspects of Black politics, a dimension that, while long-standing and evolving, most ignore or observe with passing interest. Of course, key figures who have long been looking at Black conservatism, Angela Lewis, one of the earliest kinds of examinations of at INCOPES actually that I saw was, in her work on Black conservatism, and of course, Tasha Philpott. But, this is something that I think continues to just require additional attention. And so part of what I'm looking at are, I've been looking at the speeches for the Republican convention last year, as well as some of the rap music that has been produced by Black conservatives and some of the Black female politicians that have aligned themselves with the GOP. And part of what I am looking at are I'm trying to tease out the kind of fantasies that are expressed in their rhetoric and in their politics. And part of what is really, in particular as it relates to Trump standing out, in my mind, are competing models of symbolic fatherhood, in terms of the ways in which people are called to dramaturgically reenact fealty and support for the GOP and for Trump, and also assimilationist, of course, and masochistic kinds of fantasies. Part of what I have explored in my work is the idea of Black symbolic fatherhood. Of course, draw on this using Patricia Hill Collins's understanding of there being a kind of default, right, in our understanding of politics as being a priority, on having a priority on patriarchy. That if patriarchy is not something that only influences the micro institution of the family, but other macro institutions within formal and informal politics. And see a thread in the conversation we had yesterday. Artemisia Stansberry is doing some great work looking at the politics of the 80s and 90s and why it is that certain Black women as political actors were really rejected and not well received. And part of what, I think is also critical to explore as well in terms of, what's happening. Pro mentioned the, why people are not supporting Black women in electoral politics. That kind of that default category for African-American political man is part of what explains that. But I've argued that the Black symbolic father is a male figure who stands in as a spokesperson for Black communities and whose plight can be read metonymically with that of Black people as a whole. And so when people are thinking about politics in terms of connection, identification, idealization, that tends to default to male figures. How does that operate politically is something that I think we have to continue to strive to understand. What we see with Trump is a way in which people are actually seeing him as a kind of symbolic white father, right? And so it's really, I think, fascinating to tease out the kinds of connections in terms of what's happening there. It's deeply masochistic, right? The kinds of performances around confession, around the kind of a narrative arc that at first legitimates these very spokespersons as having roots in family members that were enslaved, or having other kinds of issues around racial oppression that they've experienced in their lives, but being able to overcome that through triumph of that, not only having certain types of values that allow them to triumph, but literally because of these rescue narratives that involve Trump as a savior figure. And so, what happens, what is happening in terms of the authoritarian and fascist elements of the Republican Party, and Trump is only one element of that, but a critical one, I think has to be understood. Part of what I'm trying to tease out are the ways in which the part of what motivates and animates GOP Black spokespersons' participation in the GOP and in conservative politics generally has to do with unconscious, at times, unconscious kinds of dynamics around masochism and around denial in terms of the and other kinds of psychological defenses around dealing with the realities of racism and questions of shame and how they deal with that in terms of their own understanding of themselves and of Black politics. And so this is something that I'm just getting into. I'm very excited about, and looking forward to any kind of insights that you may be able to share. I'll stop there so we can have some discussion.
Right, thank you, Professor Alexander-Floyd. I'm going to be brief in my role as the discussant so that everyone can join in. I will start with a recap because I know everyone wasn't here early on. So we opened up with Professor Alexander-Floyd as the chair of this panel, giving homage to the fact that Dr. Prestage has provided so many of us, if not all of us, a conceptual framework expanding how we understand the Black political woman. My personal story about Dr. Prestage is that I went to my first APSA meeting in 1998. I was young, I was nervous, I was sitting on my own. I actually was pregnant. And Dr. Prestage said to Nikol, you go over there and get that little girl and tell her to join us. I have never been so touched and moved in my life. And I have been connected to NCOBS ever since. Professor Dowe talks about the legacy of Dr. Prestage's quest and talks about non-traditional political behavior. And does it in an interdisciplinary way where she looks at the fact that Prestage is in conversation with historians such as Paula Giddings because she talks about Black women as political actors before the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And then she also is passing the mantle to a historian like Martha Jones. Professor Dowe helps us think about how Prestage discusses the gender gap and leaves us with numerous provocative questions about Black politics today, including why do Black women lose when all indications say that they should win? Professor Scott talks about how Black women fund their campaigns on the state level. And she says that her discussion is in conversation with Professor Dowe, who is doing something more on the national level, but helps us think about the fact that state legislatures are pipelines to congressional office. Professor Scott reminds us that Prestage's work questions how we understand Black women's ambition, which is a critical question at this particular moment, particularly now that our vice president is of Jamaican and Indian descent. Professor Scott goes on to discuss how we can understand the increasing presence of Black women in the context of increasing campaign costs. and engages the notion of how PACs play a strong role in deciding who is able to run a competitive campaign. This helps us think about questions about how Black women receive funds and how that is in relationship to other women of different racial backgrounds. Her work is important because Professor Scott helps us think about Black women in campaign finance and the future of how we need to engage that. And finally, as most of you all heard, Professor Alexander-Floyd just finished her book, and now she's moving to a future project on gender and Black conservatives, where when she got started, I was impressed with how she was going to weave psychoanalysis into her work. But I ended up seeing what the connection was, because she is trying to ask the question about what motivates Black GOP participation, and asks, is this around masochism? Are there other psychological defenses? Is this about shame? She also talks about how Prestage gives us a framework for thinking about patriarchy. She also evokes the sociologist Patricia Hill Collins, who argues that patriarchy doesn't just influence the family, but also politics. And then Professor Alexander-Floyd helps us think about what it means to have a political Black symbolic father. So all of these papers go nicely together as we think about where we are in this political moment within the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration. I would like to open this up for discussion from people who are here during this chat. So feel free to raise your hand or put your picture up and raise your hand.
Let me see if I can see everybody at the same time.
Yeah, you can use the reaction function or, okay, Professor Simeon.
Okay, give me a minute here. All right, a few observations because I was taking a couple of notes. So given the focus on ambition, my mind immediately goes to how so many white women scholars totally ignore our body of work, because folks like Lawless, Fox, and Dolan, who focus on ambition with regard to women, they refer to them are actually referring to white women. Because as panelists have talked, you know, ambition is not something we're lacking as Black women. And there's this gross disconnect in the discipline where white women, honestly, who study women in politics, absolutely ignore our work. Maybe that's just me venting, but it comes up, you know, when I sit on panels with them, and I often call them out because the findings are different, right? And the way in which their body of work almost blames the victim, you know, opposite their white male counterpart, as being the yardstick by which white women are often lacking, right? I hear some amen. And then I'm really interested because given the cases that Professor Dowe shared with us in Arkansas and Texas, and asking us to think about Black women who have experienced losses, right? Yet they had the money. It is a really intriguing question to my mind to sort of answer the why. And I think about the work of Kim Khan, the political consequences of being a woman, because she was trying to determine what office did white women have a better chance at occupying, that of a governor or a senator. And so as we talk about Black women running for various offices at different levels, I myself kind of wonder which office comparatively do we have the greatest chance of occupying and why? And in our own, I look at Nikol, right? In our own home state, we've had 3 Black women become mayors of the largest cities, Baton Rouge, New Orleans, Shreveport. So they've arguably been successful, which takes us back to some of the literature that says Black women can presumably count on the Black vote and the vote of white women. So when I think about mayoral candidates and our successes, i.e. Sharon Wright Austin's forthcoming book, is that the office that we're most likely to be successful at occupying? And so those are just some of the thoughts that are running through my head, because I was really curious perhaps to know what Sharon was thinking about given her project on Black mayors. And that's not to say some of you, others, both in the audience and on the panel have studied Black women mayors and other Black women actors. So those are just my initial questions, observations, and thoughts.
I'll jump in real quick with that. Thank you, Evelyn, for that and for that reference too. And I'm thinking about some of the women I interviewed for my current project, and one in particular who is a county, she's a county legislative, and she ran for state legislative office several times and kept losing. And it wasn't until someone pointed out, you always win your town, you always win Rockdale, your county. You need to run for your county seat. And there were other women who talked about that they had lost in other races, but then someone else pointed out to them, this is where you win. And so I think that is a fascinating question where we need to talk about where women can win. And I think that's also for the questions that Emmett and Ash and I are going to be looking at, is also the regional piece. So like the Arkansas piece is very fascinating to me, because if anybody's from Arkansas, I know that Joyce Elliott is Black politics in the state, right? And so there's an issue around how the district is drawn, but there's also some other factors there. So I think, to your point, this where can they win also is impacted by the state politics and the regional politics as well. And then even if there's a slate as well, because people are now looking back at that particular race, Elliott, and wondering, had she ran against Tom Cotton and another Black woman ran for the position she ran, would they have been able to get in? So this whole thing of being strategic about who else is running with you in that campaign cycle, I think is also a conversation that we have to have. So I do like your question, Evelyn, because I think we have to go back and start talking about the strategies, and that these women are strategic, but then also how do we help potential candidates also think even more deeper about the considerations of when they run and which position they're seeking.
As you were talking, Pearl, I thought about my Congresswoman, Bonnie Watson Coleman. She could easily win a mayoral seat for Trenton and several other different places, but that wouldn't get her the kind of cachet in New Jersey that she needs to get to Congress. But her dad was in politics, and I think part of her association in terms of family is important, and that often is important, globally. People who are women who are part of political families. I don't know how often that would be a particular factor, but it was absolutely a factor in her entrance into politics, in the state, and and she networking that she has done over time is also amazing. But I think that's another important kind of consideration. And the kind of default to some Black male symbolic leadership, right, where men are seen as being representative of a Black community or Black communities. Not that I think that's a good thing. I think it's actually not a good thing. But and how do you measure that? If that's something that you want to do, is something to consider. But it's also absolutely an issue, particularly when we continue to have discussions about wounded masculinity and a need to shore up and in place Black men in the home. I mean, that's something that's shot through culturally and absolutely in Black churches. So that's something I would like to see people kind of respond to, share their thoughts about, and get at in their research.
Can I get in there, Duchess? This is Wendy. This panel is absolutely phenomenal. And I just feel Professor Prestage is looking down and smiling, and she has her hands up and having some real discussions in her space, hovering in our spirits, because this is absolutely phenomenal. And I'm looking at like 27 participants in a panel. This means we will be the click, click, packed room in our non-virtual spaces. So I have so much to say about all of these, but I wanted to make this connection. I think the question about where Black women run and when do they lose and why do they lose? I think that we have actually in this conversation built a really interesting kind of multiple set of research questions that are all speaking to one another. Because one of the things that I was thinking about in terms of Jamil's work around, where is the money coming from and where are these groups? We were in the chat Diane and I were getting really excited in the chat because we were talking about, it's also this idea of name recognition, right? And it's this idea of joining these groups, getting money from these collective PACs, not just because you need the actual funds, but it's also about how your name shows up, collective PAC, and how they would have these many fundraisers that they would build Black women in from multiple states, right? So then you have money coming into your race from other states. So as I'm donating for Desiree Timms, I was also donating for women in other states, because then you could, do this kind of stacking of your funds. So I think that's a really important question. But with this ambition question and where do Black women run and where do they choose to run, I want us to think about a kind of upsetting of the apple cart, because the larger women in politics literature tells us that the goal point is to get more women in Congress. But for Black women, and Pearl, this really speaks to your current book project. Is that really, like when we think about Black women's political ambition, is it that they really want to be, or is it the idea that they will evolve into women in Congress because they're on this particular preconceived political ladder? I'm going to run for school board, then I'm going to run for councilwoman, then I'm going to run for the state, and all the things we critique about that political ladder. Is it the case, or might we imagine that Black women aren't on that rung that white women candidates tend to be on?
Exactly, and that's what my findings are.
Can we imagine that Black women have strategically decided, right, their sphere of influence is different, and so they're strategizing differently about where they want to have an impact, because we don't read politics for all of the same things that white women often cite. So we may choose our starting point differently, choose our sphere of influence differently, and we as scholars need to be deliberate in allowing for that difference of choice, as opposed to saying that they are failed candidates or incomplete candidates or candidates that have not realized their political potential because they haven't followed these same particular steps. And so I see this idea around when do they connect into various kinds of political groups as being a part of that kind of strategic calculation. And I want us to open up this idea of why women run where they run. And then the other thing, Nikol, I'm very interested in where this project goes on conservative women, because I was really thinking about, you know, when you talk about these questions of what motivates conservative Black women, there is this conversation again to this idea that conservative Black women will strategically use the GOP because they can. They are an anomaly. They are going to be the quote different candidate. There is in some ways a motivation in some areas of the country for the GOP to invest in Black. We are diverse in some ways, but they also are very interesting set of candidates. I have one in my local community that I just want to watch her. Just watch her. So, because I mean, she has this, you know, all of these things that you talk about in your book about this kind of longing marriage narrative of Black womanhood and this kind of perfect family-esque presentation that then throws shade and pathology on other kinds of family arrangements. So fascinating work, want to see it come through. I'm going to stop because I could talk all day. I need to meet y'all in the lobby.
Yeah.
Good work. I want to let Professor Penderhughes get some comments in here before we get some responses from the people who gave papers.
Thank you. Thank you. Really, really exciting panel. Couple of comments. Jamil's paper on state legislative races. I would say it's in terms of organizations, yes to, you know, why you be in multiple ones, yes to the finances. But as I was saying in the chat, but you were talking at that point, so you probably didn't get a chance to see that. I think those organizations, if you think about the organizations as organizational resources for purposes of campaigning, for clearing the ground for you, you know, think about the differences in the organizational environment in Georgia in comparison to Indiana, for example. If you're a Black woman trying to run for office, and the many different kinds of specializations that those organizations provide in Georgia helps with voter registration, clearing the barriers to voters, Black voters getting access to the polls, getting to the polls, all of those kinds of things that I think make for, I would hypothesize the states where you have that kind of organizational density are going to be exciting states for the near future. And that might be a strategy across the country nationally, that is to build specialized organizations at the state level in order to make the environment more attractive. I think also we have to take into account the invention of lots of new fundraising strategies. For example, that Act Blue resource that you can contribute money and do it easily. And I understand the Republicans were very upset about that during the 2020 campaign because, you know, the Democrats could get lots of money to their candidates. The issues of ambition from Hardy Fanta, Sierra, Penderhughes, and Petal Lynn. One of the things we found in our survey, which was a survey done in 2006, 2007, that is before Obama was elected, was that lots of people stayed at the local level. They were in local level offices for many times because they emphasized their interest in their community, that is their local community. Now, I would guesstimate that the post-Obama political campaigning and campaign candidates are going to see their role very differently than people did before 2006-07. Since no Black political scientists thought Obama was going to get elected to the presidency. But now that there's been a Black president, it's not that in and of itself, but the fact that happened means we're seeing lots of other people knowing that they can make progress and that they can have ambition in ways that they wouldn't have in the past. Wendy's discussion about the fact that people conceptualize what their goals were differently is I think part of what our finding was for the Contested Transformation book, namely people were focusing on what they wanted to do for their local community. And therefore they didn't necessarily have a strategy for this kind of, you know, I'm going to move up to the state legislature and then to Congress approach. But that is possible in a way now than wasn't in the past. I don't think that anybody should expect that just because a Black woman runs, she's going to get elected. Pro was just talking about the different ways in which people could strategize winning elections. So it's a complicated process across race. Funding is important, but strategy is important. How do you mobilize? How do you get or neutralize the white vote in your state? It's not a simple process. So I've talked too long, but you know, when you talk about Jewel Prestage, I was not a student in an HBCU or with Professor Prestage, but you know, she, as you, Duchess, she insisted you come and sit with her. She was not a person who let anyone be alone, so to speak. So when she was at Iowa, not as a grad student, but in a visiting position a couple of years, many years ago now, I was still at Illinois, she spent more time being in touch. And Jules being in touch was to give you a 6 a.m. call. You know, most people are, I don't know about any of you, I'm asleep at that hour, okay? And I'm still asleep, but that was not Jewel. She'd call you and talk at length. So that was one of the things you youngins missed, the 6 a.m. calls from Jewel. Thank you for this panel. It's been really exciting.
Right. Let's see. Any other questions we have? The Congress is not the space of influence. I do think that we have a different conceptualization of, and I've always had different conceptualizations of freedom, of politics, of influence. You know, and when I think about, you know, there's a part of me that is in an abstract way wants to see, you know, Black women participating at every level of government, but not, you know, in ways that are, you know, when you think about what are the dynamics in the space of that, people who are perceived as being disorderly, you know, the kind of the radicalization of Black women, you know, that the kind of the radical dimension of Black women in politics is something that I think gains more expression at local levels of government. I mean, I think about what happens to Ayanna Pressley, you know, about the squad, particularly AOC, but all of, you know, all of that group. I mean, people who have a left of center approach. You know, it does not bode well for Black female political actors who are left of center. And so how do we make room for and understand that in terms of politics, I think is critical. Is absolutely critical. Where do we think social movements are going? Like Black Lives Matter, and how do we see that relating to electoral politics?
Well, I'll just comment, you know, I think it's inspiring that we have Cori Bush in Congress right now. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if she would be there if it hadn't been her connection to Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. And so that's some scholarship I would like to see. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, Professor Wright has a question.
Not professor yet, but hopefully soon. Hi, I have a quick question and it's so great to see all of you in conversation. This has been amazing. I'm wondering too, in talking, Dr. Nikol, Alexander-Floyd, your conversation about Black women conservatives and like kind of surfing further, like thinking about this further. I'm also thinking about Black women leaders and how they can converge from what the city would want from them, particularly, so they might not be conservative, but they might be conservative relative to the city that they govern. And so I'm thinking about the case of like Lori Lightfoot right now. And so she's put out a huge poll, a survey about how they would want police funds to be used. And majority of folks who answered for Chicago said that they would want them to scale back from those funds. And we haven't seen that come out with Lori Lightfoot. She, I'm not sure she did the exact opposite, but they surely didn't do what was wanted by the Chicago city. And so I'm wondering how we're trying to conceptualize Black women's Black women's leadership relative to the cities that they govern. And even if it's not conservative, how you reckon a more conservative approach relative to the cities that they govern.
No, I think that's an excellent example. I mean, because it points to, that the critical element of substantive equality, of what that looks like, and substantive representation, right? And to ensure that people are, I hope that we're moving to a point where we are not so focused on having new faces in high places or different places, so much so that it undermines our capacity to hold people to account. And she's a good example. She's a good example of that. So I'm sure Professor Austin will deal with those complications in her work. So I don't know if she wants to comment on that. But no, I think it points to one of the sticky issues that we have around dealing with politics and how we make sense of that, and who can and the idea that people are representatives, community actors are seen in a kind of metonymic relationship with the rest of the community. To the extent that happens, it's a mixed bag at best, and it can foreclose the ways in which we are able to hold forth critique and have accountability. And so that's a concern for me, as with many people. Somebody said there's a law professor at American U, Angela Davis, who studies prosecutors. She also works with the progressive prosecutors who are interested in running for top jobs. Tanisha Means, yes, working on Black women in the judiciary. Okay, anybody else want to just shout out some of the stuff that people are working on? When we can expect seeing some of the work that we've seen out?
Well, I'll just say this, and I mentioned this in the presentation, but in our most recent issue of NRBP, Jamil is the lead author on article on Black women and political ambition, and they tackle the process, the decision-making process. And so definitely check that out. If you haven't received your hard copy, you should be receiving it, and the abstract is online.
I just thought about this too. Who's doing an article on Melina Abdullah? About social movements and leaders, and I'm like, and I mean that seriously.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a real opportunity. If to do oral history and to emplace her leadership within the larger context of the history of Black women's leadership in social movements, and to talk about defining elements of it. I know she's done lots of different interviews and things, but to do something systematic in examining her would be It'd be really great.
You know, we had the pleasure of doing, Tamlin Tucker Works invited she and I to do a panel in conversation, but she had Melina and I on to talk about protest and politics. And it was a really wonderful conversation because the students' questions were fantastic in the sense of really they were trying to parcel out and work across this either or stance that you had to either be doing outsider politics or, you know, running for formal office insider. So the students were prepared to set us up in this kind of adversarial binary situation. And Melina and I showed up and we were complimentary and thinking about how these things fit together and thinking about a continuum as opposed to a kind of oppositional binary. And I think that's a really great space of the work. And returning to this conversation about Jewel Prestage's work, that work from the beginning showed us that these were not either or propositions, and that for Black women, they were always operating on a continuum. And so I love that idea, Nikol, because it's really, now if you talk, and it's interesting because if you talk to a Melina Abdullah, ask her to touch her pre-Trump self versus her post-Trump self, the kinds of critiques that she offers are really quite different. And the ways in which a kind of Trump space disrupts your abilities to call out formal politics in a certain kind of, to be dismissive and highly critical of formal politics, because, you know, she will even say, I didn't really think Trump could actually happen, right? And it's a really interesting space to get her in when she's really animated about it, because she was like, we messed up. Well, I didn't think it could happen. I thought you all could hold it down in the other states, because California, you know, has some liberties that those of us in places like Ohio don't have, right? In terms of understanding our political realities.
Well,
so I think we didn't
know the role of the Russians at that point, you know, either. We had to cut ourselves a little slack, you know, we didn't know that they were getting with the bots and whatnot.
So Wendy, just so you know, my students attended your panel with Melina and they cited it in one of their papers.
Oh, nice.
They couldn't believe that I knew women of your stature.
Oh, no, we can't believe we hang out with women of your stature.
I'm so true.
I know. I get cool points from my students when I can uplift Melina.
I think we're
like, oh, you know, real activists.
I think we need to be cognizant of time. Isn't the presidential address coming up? Is that where we are?
Yeah, hold on.
We could go on all day, but
this is important.
Oh
my God.
I'm looking forward to listening to Tiffany.
Yes, absolutely. But this is fantastic. And I just look forward. I see so many more junior than I scholars in the room. And it is so exciting to know that there's additional work that's coming. And I can't wait to read it, to review it, to see it.
Yes.
And know that because we're coming out of these traditions, we need this work. So it's favorably reviewed. So you got several journals that are represented on this call. So,
and when you publish stuff, please send it to us. Just send it to random people. We want it. Just send your stuff.
Yes.
Out. We share your work so we can be familiar with it and cite it. All right. I want to thank our panelists. Thank everybody for coming this morning, and for your attentiveness and for your questions and your comments. It's been really encouraging and rich. And I agree with Wendy and others who've commented that. I know that Jewel Prestage is smiling right now to see the fruits of her labor. Yeah. All right. So let's go see Tiffany. All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Panelists.
Thank you.
See you later.